I was speaking at a church in Denver, Colorado one weekend on a Sunday morning, and after the service and after I was done preaching, a fellow took me to the airport, and on the way to the airport, I asked him what he did for a living, and he said, "I am the United States Olympic diving coach." Well, that caught my attention because the Olympic Training Center was at the Broadmoor hotel in Colorado Springs. And I said to him, "Hey, when you're up there on that 10-meter platform with your back to the water and just your toes holding you to that platform, what do you tell those people?" And he said, "Well, they prepared all their lives for that moment. And so they're fully ready for it. So I tell them to do only two things: take a deep breath and jump." I want us to take a look at the story of a man who takes a deep breath and jumps, who finds himself in a very difficult situation. And you and I find ourselves in those kinds of situations from time to time as well, where there's really nothing else to do. We're totally prepared. We know what we should do. We simply have to take a deep breath and jump. In this message, I want to talk about how God changes us for the good. We've been looking at the characters of the Old Testament and words of hope and encouragement from them. We looked at Ezekiel and all the crazy things that he did and prophesied. We looked at Nebuchadnezzar and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the words of hope and encouragement that they bring to our lives. In this message, I want us to look at one of the great patriarchs. I want to look at the end of his story and a defining moment which shaped the nation of Israel, the story of redemption, and the history of salvation. The man's name is Jacob. And to understand him, we have to look at a little bit of the prequel or the backstory of how he got there and how he got married and how the events unfolded in his life to prepare him to receive the ultimate blessing of God. His name was Jacob. Let's look at the backstory. Well, as you recall, Isaac marries a woman by the name of Rebekah, and she gets pregnant with twins. And these two twins fight to be the first out of the womb because, being a patriarch, the first one out of the womb receives the blessing. That means you are in charge of all of the land, all of the possessions. You have the legacy of the family. Esau wins out. He comes out first, but holding his heel is his twin brother. He's grabbing his heel and trying to pull him back into the womb. They name him Jacob, which means in the Hebrew, the grabber, the plotter, the stealer. They fight all of their lives for that moment when Isaac will give one of them the blessing. And it is to be Esau because he's the first out of the womb. Over time, Jacob tricks Esau and deceives his father and gets the blessing. When he did, Esau was enraged and he burned with anger and he wanted to kill Jacob. So Jacob fled to Haran in the Judea wilderness to save his life. He was afraid of dying. He had got the blessing, but he had lost the family, the home, the possessions, the future, the legacy. Now hang on, this story really gets crazy. On the way to Haran, in the wilderness, he has a dream. It's called Jacob's Ladder, where God descends from heaven and tells Jacob that you indeed will receive a great blessing. When he gets to Haran, he falls in love with a woman by the name of Rachel, but he ends up marrying Leah. It's a long, complicated story. And he also marries two other women, two concubines. So he has 4 wives and 12 sons. The 12 sons become the 12 tribes of Israel. It's at that point that he makes a big mistake. Isaac favors Rachel over all of the other wives, and he favors Joseph, all of the other brothers. They get angry, they get jealous. There's a lot of dysfunctionality from this point on in the family. 20 years pass. God has blessed Jacob. He's wealthy, he's got possessions, he's got wives, he's got sons. But during this time, God has been at work in his heart. He realizes he has some unfinished business with his brother Esau and his father Isaac. Like the prodigal son, he comes to his senses and he realizes it's time to go home and repair and restore the damage that he has done and the hurt that he has caused to the people who he loved and the wrongdoing that he has brought into their lives. It's at this point that we see that Jacob does something he's never done before. He prayed to God. Nowhere in the entire course of his life do we ever see him kneeling before God, But at this moment, he tells God two things. One, he says, I'm unworthy. I'm overwhelmed by the grace that you've given to me, the possessions, all of the blessings that you've given to me. I left with a staff in my hand and a stone for my head, and you have given me so much. You've given me wives and possessions and children. The second thing he prays to God is he says, I'm really afraid, God. I'm afraid of my brother. I admit my fear, and I call on you to help me and remember the promise that you made to me. He prays to God because he's afraid. He wants God to remake him, to give him courage and strength to face Esau and his father, Isaac. God is about to transform his heart. Not only has he changed him to want to go home and restore broken relationships and set right that which is wronged, but he wants to go in love and grace and peace with his family. So then Jacob sends word to Esau that he's coming home. When the messengers come back from talking to Esau, they bring him some very bad news. Esau is still very angry. He is enraged. He has gathered together 400 what he calls mighty men to take on Jacob and to kill him. So in great fear, Jacob divides his family into two, and he sends one half the family across the border on one side and one half headed in the other direction. He figures maybe one of them will survive. The grabber takes his wives, his children, his servants, his possessions, and he sends them across the Jabbok River. He stays behind, but he sends the family forward. And that's where we pick up the story in Genesis 32, verse 24. So Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him till daybreak. This is the story of how God changes us for the good. And the first thing we see here is that God breaks him, that God wrestles with him. He wants to break him. He wants to draw him back to God. Jacob left alone there on the side of the river Jabbok. He has nothing left with him, not his wife, his children, his sheep, his cattle, his camels, his possessions, his wealth. It's all gone. It's all crossed the river. He is there alone, except for one thing that must happen to him. He must wrestle with God for his very soul. He must get his relationship with God right. Well, who is this strange appearance that comes to Jacob in the middle of the night? He's all there alone. Hosea tells us in chapter 12, verse 3, in the womb, he, Jacob, grasped his brother's heel. As a man, he struggled with God. He struggled with the angel and overcame him. He wept and begged for his favor. It's an angel sent from God to wrestle with Jacob. You see, all of his life, Jacob had struggled with a CEO question, with a who's in charge question. All of these years, the angel comes to him and says, you've been fighting against God. You've been grabbing, you've been plotting, you've been stealing. Now it's time to go and set things right with God. You cannot have two masters. Where your treasure is, there you will find your heart as well. Your treasure, your master, will own you. And God wants to be that treasure. He wants to be that master in your life. He doesn't want all of your stuff. He wants you. He wants your soul and your spirit. So there alone in the dark, in the night, in the soul of Jacob, he wrestles with the very depth and core of his being to settle the question once and for all, who is in charge? Who leads me? Who guides me? Who directs me? By morning, the angel calls off the fight. Jacob is now a broken man. He's exhausted. The grabber is gone. A new life has come. He's changed. He sees things differently. Now, it's at this point that God touched him. And at that moment, the man will never again be the same. It's complete surrender. When God touched him, the grabber, the proud man, was a broken man. It was complete surrender to the sovereign will and providence and authority of God in his life. Do you remember the story of Eric Liddell, the great Olympian back in the 1920s in Paris? His best event was the 100-yard dash, but because it was on a Sunday, he refused to race. Later in the week, he ran the 400 and won it. He became an international celebrity. Do you recall what he did next with his life? He went away to China to become a missionary to the Chinese people. He disappeared. Over time, he was interred in a concentration camp where he continued to minister to the Chinese people. In the last 2 years of his life, he had inoperable brain cancer. He was dying day after day after day. Finally, at the moment of his death, it's recorded that he said, "It's complete surrender." What a beautiful way to die. In complete surrender. He disappeared from all the wealth and the glory and the glamour and the status that he could have had to minister to people and care for them. And even though he was imprisoned and dying of cancer, he still loved his God and said to him, "It's complete surrender." And this is where God wants to get Jacob. It's complete surrender. Sooner or later, all of us have to wrestle with God with the question of who's in charge of our lives. We might wrestle with him physically or emotionally or spiritually. But sooner or later, all of us have to answer that question. Who is ultimately in charge? It's complete surrender for Jacob. He is now a changed man. God has broken him. Not only does God break him for his own purposes to draw him back to God, but then we see that God brands him. Look at what takes place in chapter 32, verse 25. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. What's happening here? The angel touches the socket of his hip and wrenches it out of place, dislocates it. And I'm sure at that moment that Jacob cries out in agony and pain. Now the question becomes, why did the angel do that? Why did he dislocate his hip, wrench it out of place? So that every step of his life, for the rest of his life, he would walk with a limp. He's doing that because he's branding him. He's giving him something to remember the rest of his life. It's a spiritual milestone for him of the brokenness and the drawing close to God. Paul said he had a thorn in his side, an illness or a relational failure. That God gives us these moments, and then he allows us to have a time when we walk with a limp to remind us of who we belong to and who's in charge of our lives. When I was a child, I remember watching Roy Rogers and Hopalong Cassidy on the black and white TVs, and they're riding their horses so fast through the West. I asked my father one day, I said, "Hey, Dad," and I knew the answer. I said, "What do you think is faster, a horse or a car?" And he said, "It's a car." And I said, "No way. No way can a car go faster than Roy Rogers or Hopalong Cassidy can ride their horses." And as they were riding them, they would gather up the cattle in the evenings, and they would brand them. They would get this molten red hot iron, take it from this burning fire, and they would tie the cattle up, and they would brand that cattle with the symbol that represented the owner who held possession of that calf. And this is what God is doing here to Jacob. He is branding him with a limp. You now belong to me forever. The story concludes in Genesis 32, verse 26. Then the man said, "Let me go, for it is daybreak." But Jacob replied, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." The man asked him, "What is your name?" "Jacob," he answered. Then the man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome." Jacob said, "Please tell me your name." But he replied, "Why do you ask my name?" Then he blessed him there. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "It is because I saw the face of God, and yet my life was spared." And Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "It is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared." Well, not only do we see that God breaks Jacob, but he brands him and he blesses him. But Jacob says, we're not done yet. I will not let you go unless you bless me. The angel's response is, what is your name? You see, to the Hebrew, when a child was born, a name was a big deal. Great care was given to name that child properly, just as it is today. And the Hebrew name Grabber was the one that was given to Jacob. It represented his essence, a title for him. It's who he was at the core of his being, the grabber, the plotter, the stealer. But God wants a confession out of him. What's your name, Jacob? And Jacob says, well, everywhere I go, I have to tell people I'm the grabber, the stealer, the heel grasper. And so here before God, Jacob acknowledges who he is. He has a story and a history of failure and of grabbing and plotting and stealing. He has to own up to that. But here's the good news. Here's the blessing. The angel says to him, you're no longer the grabber. You're Israel, the one who struggled with God. You've been fighting at the very core of your being, wrestling with who's in charge. And now you know, after all this wrestling and all this struggle, now you know that God wants to not only make you a new person, but he wants to rename you as a new person, with a new future, with a new destiny, with new dreams. You will receive that blessing. We can't change who we are, but God can. He changes the name of Abram to Abraham and Sarai to Sarah, because God had changed them at the very core of their being. It's like we have this hardwire inside of us, this chip inside of us. If you've ever been to a software company and seen the coders, the engineers creating these codes, they're so intense and so deep and so complicated and detailed. And once they're done, they really can't be changed. We have this hard drive inside of us, and we can't change it. But God can. He can change our operating system. God can rewrite and reprogram who we are and change our chips. So he says to him, tell me your name. He already knows his name. It's Jacob. He wanted Jacob to confess, I've been the grabber. And when he did, God blesses him. He saw the face of God. He names the place Peniel. Jacob, the proud man, the grabber, is now Jacob, the broken man, the new man. God gave him what he always wanted, in God's time and in God's way. Isn't it interesting that whatever God sends into our lives, when we don't understand things, or why is this happening, or I didn't write this script, or it isn't supposed to turn out this way, know this, God says, I will touch you, I will change you, I will draw you to me, I will draw you closer, I will bless you with new life, with transformation, with restoration. This is how God changes us for the good. So notice Genesis 32, verse 31. The sun rose above him as he passed Peniel, and he was limping because of his hip. The night's over, the sun rises, he leaves Peniel, he leaves the wrestling with the angel of who's in charge, but he leaves with a limp. He walks the rest of his life with a limp. Something has happened. God has broken him. God has changed him. God has branded him. God has blessed him. And to remind him of that night, he will walk the rest of his life with a limp. There, at Peniel, God brands him and remakes him. There are no more plans, no more schemes, no more grabbing. He falls in love with the promises and the grace and the blessings of God. It took 20 years to prepare Jacob to go home. But now he goes home as a broken man, as a branded man, as a blessed man, dragging his leg behind him as a cripple, moving forward to meet his father and his angry brother Esau. When he does, they embrace him. They are restored. There is forgiveness which takes place. There is full restoration and transformation in their relationship. But only when Jacob was prepared by God to go home. We all walk with a limp. At some point in our lives are changed, not out of our strength, but out of our brokenness. We all walk with a limp as a broken people. God, in that limp, makes us moldable and usable and grace-filled. He brands us. He says, what is your name? What really is your name? The grasper, the limper, or Israel? The one who had wrestled with God. The one who was broken, who was branded, and who was blessed. And I know that if he walked into your life or my life this very day, what would strike us most about Jacob would be his limp. It was undeniable. Everybody could see it. He limped for the rest of his life. It was the sign that he was prepared to go home to be restored. It's how God changes us. And I know that some of us walk with a limp, a dislocation, a displacement in our lives. Maybe it's our family of origin or some big failure or an estrangement or a betrayal. I want you to know that that's how God changes us. It's how God touches us. It's painful at the moment, but it's how God breaks us, brands us, and blesses us. Jacob, the proud man, is now Jacob, the broken man, the branded man, the blessed man. He is prepared to receive the full blessing of God in his life.